Hi everyone. I am going to be looking for my lovely host, Joseph Conte. So let me just see if I can send him a request. For those out there who are watching, I am not a tax expert. I am a nurse. And I also work for Trusted as their social media manager and so I was a travel nurse for about 3 years, and so I'm very familiar of how scary travel nurse taxes are. So I'm super excited to kind of help demystify all that today. And there he is. Hi, Joe.
Hi, how you doing, Casey?
I'm doing great. It's so good to see you. Can you believe that we're doing this?
Here we are. I figured it out how to get on here.
I know. I have to tell everyone this is our first Instagram live. I'm honestly was like a little nervous. I was like, am I going to do this right? Is this what the cool kids do? Am I an influencer now?
It's my first as well, and my 13-year-old daughter is very excited.
Oh, that's awesome. I bet she's pretty proud of you. Dad's going on Instagram Live with
She's
the company.
she's probably listening or
Oh,
watching.
good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I know this is not a topic that everyone gets really excited about, but everyone really wants more information on. And honestly, as a travel nurse, I found when I first started, it was really, really hard to get good quality information from companies, from looking online. It was really unclear kind of like what I needed to do to make sure I avoided getting audited and did everything correctly. So I really appreciate you taking the time with us today. It's really much needed for not only myself, but other travel nurses out there.
Well, thanks for having us. Yeah, it's our pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So before we start, I just want to do a big disclaimer, and I think Joe can kind of reinforce this as well. We cannot give any professional tax, legal, or accounting advice during this for anyone specifically. I will encourage you, if you have any specific questions, please hold those until after the event, and please share you can call Joe or another tax consultant. I recommend going obviously with Mr. Joseph Conte, who's joining us today, but we can get to that later. Um, I think the first thing I want to start with is one thing. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We will try to get to them. We have a lot of content that we want to get through today. I actually requested that from our Facebook group as well as from our Instagram for nurses to submit questions prior to this event. So I have a whole list of questions already to answer, and hopefully we'll cover the information that you need to know. If not, please go ahead and do it in a comment, and we'll try to get to it. But like I said, if it's specific to you, then we'll might like pass, and you can ask Joseph after the event. So let's go ahead and get started. So Joe, can you give us a brief overview of why travel nurse taxes are different from most people's taxes?
Sure. Yeah, there's a couple of main points that I think maybe everyone listening here is sort of experienced, especially if they've been doing this for a little while. But the main points to worry about or be concerned about are tax home status, properly maintaining your tax home. Working in multi-states creates some issues with those state returns and make sure those are prepared properly. And then I guess making sure that the stipends you receive are going to be tax-free and kind of working to maintain the tax-free status of those stipends. Those are kind of the big points here to focus on for travelers.
Absolutely. And for those who are not aware, as a travel nurse, if you maintain a tax home, and you will qualify for tax-free stipends meant to cover your meals and incidentals and all your travel expenses, including housing. And that's why travel nursing can be a little bit more lucrative. You have these higher pay packages. Not only they're higher pay packages, but a lot of it's not being taxed. You keep more money in your pocket. But what we're going to cover today is that there's a few things you need to make sure you're doing so you're not audited later on by the IRS and found that you weren't, obviously maintaining a tax home or anything of that sort. So I guess to qualify for that tax-free stipend, you've already mentioned tax homes. I think there's a little confusion around what your permanent home is versus your tax home. Can you kind of explain that?
Sure. For most people, they're the same thing, but not for travelers. It's a whole different sort of story. So a permanent home really refers to where maybe your driver's license is registered, where you're registered to vote, maybe where you receive mail. It's sort of a legal residence. It's your ties to that legal residence. So a tax home could be something different if you're a traveler. the point of a tax home is mainly your economic home, where you're earning income, where you have historically earned income, have you there, where you've established economic ties. So again, for many people, it's one and the same, but for travelers, it may be different.
Absolutely. I think I get a little confused because when I first started, I'm from North Carolina, so I thought that I could, but I worked in Nashville, Tennessee right out of school for 2 years. And so when I went to go travel, I was like, oh, I'll make my parents' residence my tax home. But technically, thinking that it was just like my permanent residence, and I didn't understand that. But technically, my tax home for the last 2 years had been Nashville. And so that was a little confusing. So for travel nurses, what do they need to do to make sure they're maintaining a tax home? Like, what are the IRS requirements for maintaining a tax home?
So there's a couple of key points here, and one is when you go on assignment, make sure that you're incurring living expenses at your tax home. So you don't, in other words, you're not abandoning your tax home. So if you take an assignment in Nashville and your home is North Carolina, in order to qualify for the tax-free stipends, you need to have expenses at your tax home while traveling in Nashville. So that's one pretty basic one. It's a strict requirement there. If you're not paying bills at your tax home, there's really no duplication of expenses, and your tax-free stipends could be at risk.
Okay.
And another one is don't stay away too long, especially in one area. Don't spend too much time in a travel location. If you're there more than 12 months consecutive, or really 12 months out of a 24-month period, you could, again, be at risk of forfeiting the tax-free status of the stipends. So you can still receive the stipends, but at that point, they would likely become taxable as income, and it kind of takes away some of the luster of the compensation package of a travel nurse.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the other thing is return back to that home, or spend at least 30 days at home during the year. During any 12-month period, you should be going back between assignments, maintaining those ties, establishing those ties, and continuing to do so, and also possibly working at home when you return home.
Okay. Do travel nurses need to actually maintain a part-time job back home or wherever their tax residence is to qualify for the tax-free stipend, or is that just kind of recommended? That's something that I was always a little bit confused on.
So that's a good question. Normally, when you have a tax base, your economic home, your tax home is the same as your permanent home. Then you go out on assignment. And when you're traveling, when you return back home during that circumstances, you don't have to work at home. It's always helpful, and it's always a positive thing to work or even look for work when you return to your tax home between assignments. But as long as you have that working base when you start traveling, then it's not required to go back home and work.
Okay. That's really good to know, because I feel like I knew a lot of nurses who actually kept part-time, like went per diem at their hospitals. And so what they would do to maintain their tax homes, and what they would do would be go home in between their assignments, worked for a couple of weeks, and then go back. And that was one way they kind of maintain their tax home. But that's not available for, I know that it's not available for everyone. It's hard to kind of get those per diem jobs, especially if you're switching where your permanent and tax home is. So that's really helpful to know. So you said, let me make sure I get this right.
Mm-hmm.
Duplicating expenses, and making sure that you're actually accruing expenses at your tax home, and
right.
making sure it's far enough away. It's not within a certain radius. Well, actually, we need to get to that. If you have to travel overnight technically to work there, and you don't stay there too long. Is there anything else that I missed with that?
The returning home portion is important as well.
Okay, good. That's good. Thank you for making sure I got all that. So, see, I've already done this for 3 years, and I took off from traveling for about a year, and I'm already forgetting all this. It's tough to keep.
But you brought up a point we haven't discussed yet, and that was the distance away from your tax home. So, yeah, that's also important. So a travel assignment, in order to qualify for the stipends tax-free, we didn't mention it should be a travel assignment, meaning it should require an overnight stay in order for you to perform your job duties, responsibly. So that might mean 50 miles. It might mean 60 miles. In some cases, a 50-mile rule is sort of talked about out there, and it's a rule of thumb. It's not necessarily an IRS rule. It's more of a guideline that's out there, and sort of an established, general guideline that businesses use.
Yeah, I was told when I first started by my recruiter, that was not Trusted Health, by the way, that as long as you were 15 miles away from wherever your tax home was, you were fine. Like, you qualified for the stipend. And it was, couple years later that I realized that's actually not true. You need to, I know it's kind of vague from the IRS standards, but you actually need to prove that you have to stay overnight if you travel there for work, correct?
Yeah, it has to be a reasonable expectation that you can't be driving, after a long shift and driving back and forth every day. It could be 40 miles in some circumstances. You just don't know. It depends on each location, the specifics of each location.
Got you. I just realized I was drinking water out of a wine glass, and so just so no one thinks I'm drinking on the job, this is water, I promise.
It's 5 o'clock here, so.
Oh yeah, that's true. I'm in Central Time, so it's not 5 o'clock yet. So someone asked, and I just want to go ahead and address this. What does occurring expenses at your tax home mean? Like have bills in your name at that address?
It could mean that, but really what it means in general is that you have an obligation to pay some sort of living expenses contributing to maintaining a household while traveling. So it might mean rent, it might mean a mortgage, in which case it's easy to document. It could be an expense sharing arrangement with your roommates or parents or friends or whoever it might be. But it should be documented and tracked in a way that's easy to reproduce, meaning a Venmo or a check or some sort of transaction that can be explained if needed.
Okay, perfect. The last question, we will get to that. Don't you worry, we're going to cover that today. It was about LLCs. I know that should have been your favorite question of the season.
Yeah, lots of questions on LLCs this year.
Yeah. Let's see. So I think we kind of covered that first chunk of covering about tax homes and how you establish those and how you maintain them. So when filing taxes, this is a great question. We can go ahead and start with this one. Someone just asked, does travel nursing pay in W-2s or 1099s?
Well, the great majority are W-2s. We've seen 1099s, sporadically, maybe not as nurses, but in other maybe specialties. There's a few 1099s. For the great majority, it's W-2.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say all of mine when I traveled were W-2s, and I know at Trusted Health, all the ones I've seen go out for any of our nurses have been W-2s as well. Going back to one thing I just realized I forgot to ask, we talked a lot about duplicating expenses. Do nurses need to keep track of like all their receipts and all of that good stuff to prove if they did get audited, example, if they by the IRS, like do they need to prove, like have a paper trail that they were duplicating expenses this whole time?
They do. So it's always good to keep that in case it comes up. And that's why we talked a few minutes ago about maintaining some sort of trail, a check or a Venmo history or some sort of transaction history. If it's a cash transaction, it's not easy to show that there was a duplication of expenses, and that could put you at risk. Okay. So other than just lodging, the other receipts aren't really necessary for this. If you have meals or things like that, those receipts or even professional expenses, whether it's uniforms or CEUs, you don't necessarily need those receipts to maintain your tax home or to take as deductions because those are no longer deductible. It's not a bad idea to save those for other reasons, but for tax purposes, they're no longer deductible. So mainly focus on travel, lodging related receipts to maintain the tax-free stipends. Okay. Those are the key ones.
So if you're paying rent, if in your home state and wherever you're working, I guess any utilities bills, anything of that sort would be what you really want to be.
Sure, and airfare, if you're flying to an assignment, keep track of the airfare records. If you drive, keep track of the long distance drive, keep track of some of those records. If any of those types of expenses, you can hang on to those.
Someone just asked us, and I think this is a great question. How long should they keep those receipts for?
The home-based receipts, the travel receipts, the duplication of expenses, at least 3 years. The longer the better. 7 is probably the maximum that you need to keep them, but at least 3. Okay,
at least 3. That's really, really good to know. So you've already mentioned kind of briefly that, and this is a question you probably get all the time, like what tax deductions do travel nurses qualify for?
Right.
Can you cover that a little bit more, kind of like what deductions are available and what they need to be tracking, keeping receipts for?
Sure. So the reason to keep the housing and lodging receipts are not because they're deductions, but really to maintain the tax-free stipends in support of that. But in terms of tax deductions, there aren't too many receipts that you need to track. The main deductions available would be mortgage interest, property taxes, if you have those, state income tax, which is reported on your W-2. So we would be able to figure that number out for you based on your tax documents. Charitable donations, those are deductible, and medical expenses in some limited cases, if they're, really pretty high. So those are the main expenses that you can still take as tax deductions for a W-2 travel employee.
Okay, so I know that I feel like used to people would ask about mileage and food and all of that, but that's technically covered by your stipend, right? So that you couldn't deduct that.
Correct. Yeah, the mileage to and from the assignment or to and from work, not deductible. Meals as well, not deductible. The stipends that you're receiving are designed to cover those.
Yeah. I think some nurses I've heard get a little bit frustrated because those aren't deductible anyways, but I think it's just good for them to understand, like, that's what that stipend's for, and that's why you get that large chunk of tax-free money. So
that's exactly right. And the IRS also increased the standard deduction in the last 2 years, so your standard deduction is pretty significant now. So that sort of makes up for the fact that some of these deductions are no longer available.
Okay.
In many cases, it's even a better situation for the standard deduction versus what would have been the itemized in the past.
Okay. Can you just clarify for anyone who doesn't know what that means, like the standard versus itemized deduction?
Sure. So prior to 2018, as a travel nurse, or really any employee, was able to deduct certain employee-related expenses against their W-2 income. Things like CEUs, meals and allowances, things like that. Those used to be deductible. Scrubs or insurance, liability insurance, those were deductible, no longer deductible now. The offset there is that the IRS has given you a higher standard deduction, which everybody gets regardless of whether they have any deductions or not.
Okay.
So they've sort of made up for that a little bit.
It's almost like you've answered all these questions once or twice before, Joe.
Yes, yes. several times today, in fact, before this call, and every day. It's what we do. Yeah.
I know. I really appreciate you taking the time to answer these questions, because I know you must be so busy entering into tax season.
No, we're happy to be here. This is what we do. We're happy to give as much help as we can.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So this has already been asked, and I would love to address this a little bit further, because I was actually asked this several times in our Facebook group and through our Instagram. Will owning an LLC give me a tax break?
Okay, so yeah, this is a question that's been coming up a lot lately, especially this year, and it's a tricky area for a travel nurse. So if you're a W-2 employee receiving stipends from an agency, an LLC is not going to help you. It's not the appropriate way to track your business expenses. The only way an LLC is going to help you as a traveler, as any taxpayer, would be is if you have a sole proprietorship or a business that you're operating, an income producing product or service that you're out there selling and receiving pay from customers or clients. So if that's the case, then you can deduct any expenses related to the generation of that income. If you're working as an employee, as a travel nurse or a travel employee on a W-2, an LLC is not the appropriate vehicle to help you reduce your taxes.
I know a lot of you can see it on Trusted's platform right now. I know a lot of nurses are making a lot of money right now that is taxed. So I understand like why they were looking for these ways to kind of reduce the amount of taxable income they have. I'm sure like a lot of nurses out there made a lot of money in this past year. So I understand it. Yeah,
the best way, just to wrap up that point, the best way to minimize your tax liability is to contribute as much as you can to a tax-deferred plan through the employer is typically the best way. 403B or 401K, something like that. That's really the most effective way to reduce your taxes as an employee.
That's really good advice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Think about that.
Should be taking advantage of that as much as possible.
Yeah. So this is kind of related to talking about 2020. I know that a lot of us received stimulus checks. What do we need to file that, or what do we need to do with that money, I guess, when it comes to our taxes?
Okay, yeah, so this is coming up quite a bit here in January and into February. So the bottom line is they're not taxable. The stimulus payments that were received are not taxable, but they have to be reported on the tax return. The reason, if they're received, and the reason is so if they weren't received, for one, then you can claim them on the tax return. That's number one. And number two, if they were received, sometimes they're prorated and reduced. They weren't just the standard $1,200 or $600 payments. In some cases, they're reduced. So it's important to report the exact amount that you received, both back in 2020, which is around April or May, and also this past month in January and into February of 2021. It's important to record the exact amount that was received.
Okay.
So in some cases, you may be eligible for an additional stimulus payment based on what you report and what you received in the past. So it's important to get that right.
Okay, that's really, really good to know. I think that's something that I didn't even think of until we had kind of been setting up these chats. I kind of forgot even about the stimulus checks because the year before I'd worked as a travel nurse and taken a lot of time off, so I qualified. So I'm gonna have to file those this year myself too.
So what's going to happen if you fail to report those on your tax return? You may get another stimulus check because the IRS is you're telling them that you didn't receive it yet. So if you file your returns and don't tell them you received $1,200 and $600, they're going to send you another $1,200 and $600. Then they'll figure it out soon enough, and you'll get letters back, and it'll just cause more trouble for everybody. So it's best to get ahead of it,
That's
and
good to know.
so there's no issues.
Someone just asked about 401ks versus Roth IRA. We actually have a lot of content about this on our blog related to finances and retirement savings. So if you go to trustedhealth.com/blog, you'll be able to kind of search through all of our financial content there. And that should definitely help you out. We also did a lot of events related to finances. So if you go to YouTube and search Trusted Health, you'll see a lot of those events as well. So any of that kind of stuff, I would definitely go take a look at that content. It's really helpful. So this is a question that we've had already in this chat, but it's also something really good to know. So for example, one year I worked in California, Washington State, and Texas. And it was a little confusing because some of those states did have state income tax and some didn't. And my permanent home, by the way, I did end up establishing it in North Carolina. Which states do you need to file state tax forms in?
Okay, so in general, the way it really works is every state in which you work, you should be filing a tax return. So you're paying income tax on the income you earn in each state. That's the kind of the general overview of that. But if you're working in a state like Texas or Florida, Nevada, there's no income tax there, so there's no filing requirement there. So you don't have to file a tax return there, but that income that you earn there will be taxed by your home state. So it's important that that's reported properly and calculated properly so that you don't end up maybe not paying your home state, and they'll eventually find out about that as well, and you'll get those letters.
Someone has asked, are we saving this live for later viewing? Absolutely. You'll see it saved to our Instagram TV channel, so anyone can go back and access it at any time. Going back to what we were just talking about, yeah, I was really disappointed when I worked in Texas, and I was like, whoo, there's no state income tax here. This is awesome. I'm going to get all that money. And then I realized I had to file it in North Carolina, and I was still taxed. So that's something to take into consideration when you're filing in if you're a permanent address, or your tax home is in a really high taxing state, you're going to get those high taxes taken out of your paycheck. So that's something important to know.
Did you end up owing your home state, or did they have taxes withheld during the year so you didn't end up owing too much?
Oh my gosh, I love that you asked this, because this is something that I meant to share and I completely forgot to add it to my notes. I ended up owing because this is something that you need to have your travel agency do, is making sure that they're taking out state taxes. Some of them don't for whatever reason, or I'm not really sure like why some don't and some do, but make sure they take out your state taxes, because you're going to end up owing it at the end of the year, especially if you're a travel nurse and it's in a state that doesn't have state income tax. You need to make sure they're taxing you throughout the year for your home state. Otherwise, you're going to owe a ton, because I owed, and that was really disappointing, because if you're like me, I feel like every year I count on that tax return. I'm like, ooh, something to go towards saving, or this trip I'm planning. And then that year I didn't have one. I owed.
Yeah, those are the tough conversations, and those travelers that go to non-tax states and they end up owing their home state, $1,000 or $500, and that happens. It happens often. So be careful now. I usually tell my clients to make sure if you're in a state like Texas or Florida and your tax home is a state with the state income tax, make sure they're withholding properly.
Yeah, that's a really, really, I'm so glad that you brought that up because that's such a good nugget of advice that I think some people sometimes gloss over, and is super helpful. Let's see. So I think you probably, I mean, you help a lot of nurses prepare their taxes. So I feel bad. I kind of forgot to introduce you at the beginning of this. If you want to kind of tell everyone now a little late.
Sure. Sure. So we know my name by now. It's Joe. My last name is Conti. So I'm the CPA and owner of Travel Nurse Tax. Our job here is to help advise travelers prepare tax returns for travelers, multi-states. Everything is done remotely. So, you know, we're here in Florida, but most of our clients are kind of everywhere, all over the country. So everything is done remotely. You can call in, you can email. You know, we have a web portal where we can share documents. So that's kind of how we're set up right now. We were set up this way before the pandemic, and now it's sort of the way of business in general now. So we're kind of ahead of the game there.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're happy to take questions from anybody, you know, throughout the year. If they just have a question about taxes and maybe you don't need help filing them, we're happy to take those questions as well.
Okay, perfect. I'm so sorry that I forgot to introduce you until now. I was like, we have all the questions we have to get through.
No problem. No problem.
So going back to what we were kind of talking about, filing state taxes and everything, someone just asked a question that I think is really important to make sure this is understood. Do you have to pay home state and taxes and the state that you worked in?
Well, what's going to happen is you're going to pay the state in which you worked. So let's say it's California and your residence is North Carolina. You're going to pay California on the travel income that you earn. Then when you file in North Carolina as a residence, they're going to tax you on that income, but you don't have to pay double tax. So what you do is you tell North Carolina that you paid California, let's say you paid them $500. So essentially you get a credit back to reduce your North Carolina tax by that same $500. You know, give or take depending on the tax rates, but that's the concept behind it. So you're not going to pay tax twice, as long as you do it properly. We see many returns every year where, why did I owe my home state $1,000 and I had withholdings everywhere? And that's because you paid California and you forgot to apply for the credit in North Carolina, so you paid North Carolina again. So a good red flag is if you owe your home state a bunch of money, there might be an issue with how the returns were prepared. It's sort of a red flag to keep an eye on. Yep,
absolutely. That's a really, really, really good point because that hurts me thinking about paying taxes in both states. So going back, since you're the tax professional who helps nurses, you know, file their taxes every year, what's some advice for helping nurses file their taxes for 2021? Like, what do you think they need to be doing in the next year to help them file their taxes for 2021?
Sure. So this is a question that we get often through email or through phone calls. They find us online. They, you know, new travelers are getting ready to go out and not really sure what to expect. So we take these calls a lot, and mainly what we try to reinforce is to maintain the tax home. What we touched on earlier. Make sure that you're properly maintaining your tax home and not abandoning it. Tracking those travel and lodging expenses, both at home and while on assignment. That's the key, because that's the way to really maintain the tax-free stipends. That's the big one. And then down the road, make sure you're returning home and doing all those things that are required to continue to maintain the tax home.
Okay, perfect. So going on to the next section, we're going to go over a little over 30 minutes. I hope that's okay, Joe.
Sure. Perfect.
I think that, you keep hearing about people getting audited, but when you look up online, it's really hard to understand like what triggers an audit, who gets audited, like do travel nurses get audited more frequently than other people or not? There's a lot of questions here. So I think I just want to see, one question I got a lot too, actually, let's start off with this one, was should my hourly be over $20 an hour to avoid getting audited?
So the question is, should it be over $20 an hour? That's the first question. Yes, probably, because you're professionals and trained and experienced. It should be. Will that help you avoid getting audited? Not necessarily. It really what the issue is. If your wages are too low, that and then your stipends are too high, that's kind of an imbalance, and that's where you have a little more risk. So if your wages are $12 an hour, and you're a professional nurse with 5, 8, 10 years experience, it's not really what the market pays, and that could put you at risk. being underpaid can put you at risk for an audit. So that's a bit of a concern. But you should generally be probably at that ballpark of 20 an hour or more, depending on the market, specialty, and really experience.
Okay. So that's one thing, is kind of like the low hourly rate. A really low hourly rate can trigger an audit. Is there anything else that can trigger an audit that you've seen?
Well, the IRS has these, they call lifestyle audits. If they see, a very low income number reported, but quite a bit of other expenses or mortgage, a big mortgage or property taxes, that could sort of trigger a lifestyle audit. It's not going to be common for a travel nurse. One of the things that a traveler might be concerned with as far as an audit trigger would be that LLC. If you're reporting income or income and deductions on an LLC without really having support for it, that could be an audit risk, especially if you're taking losses continually. A new business may incur losses in the first couple of years, but if it continues to just show losses without an income-producing product or service, that could definitely be an audit risk. The IRS looks for those, more commonly.
Okay.
So,
do you think travel nurses get audited more than other people, or no?
you know what? I don't. There's really no reason for that right now, especially. So maybe 3 years ago, when there were a lot more tax deductions available, it's still very unlikely. But currently, with the new tax code, where a travel nurse, you really can't take too many tax deductions, so it's really unlikely to be audited as a traveler. That's not to say it won't happen, because it does happen, but it's very, very unlikely.
Okay.
Unless you're reporting.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, unless you're reporting some of those business expenses and things like that we talked about, that could put you at a higher risk.
I'm sure there's a big audible sigh of relief if everyone was with us. Whew.
Exactly. Everyone just dropped off now. They're all happy and relaxed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really good to know, because I remember Googling am I going to get audited as a travel nurse? I kind of just the way that information is presented, you're like, I'm going to do everything wrong and I'm going to be audited. So I think that's really, really helpful.
I get that question a lot. It's a very big concern amongst travelers, and probably any taxpayer, but travelers ask it a lot, and it's really not a major high risk. It's for business owners, sole proprietors, super high earners. The IRS focuses on those folks, and that's where the most, possibility for malfeasance is, and for recovery from the IRS. Travel nurses, they're not really going to have too much interest in general.
Okay, that's really, really helpful.
That's good news.
And then I got this question, and I wanted to see, I know you've been talking this whole time, so if you need a sip of water or anything, feel free to take it while
I'm good.
Really quick. What is the process if a nurse does get audited? Can you give a really brief summary of that?
Sure. So, the term audit is kind of a loaded term. So if the IRS sends a letter requesting more information from somebody, from a taxpayer, which that happens frequently, to me, that's not really a full audit. They're asking a question about this, that, or the other. Depends what it might be. Then it's simple. If we were involved, or if you needed help, we could help respond to those letters. And if we were a client, we would respond to those letters, as part of our service to begin with. So normally they want to see, the most commonly asked question from the IRS or the states would be, hey, you worked in California, show me your W-2 that shows your California wages and taxes paid, if you're a North Carolina resident. So those questions come up every year, a handful of those, and we respond to those with copies of the W-2 and the other state returns, and usually that's just not an issue, and it goes away. Okay. So that's kind of the process. If it's a full-blown audit, the IRS would look for copies of basically every document that's to support what's the numbers that are in your tax return. So any income, any deductions, the IRS would want support for any or all of those, depending on exactly where they're focusing on the audit.
Okay. My other question was, if the company that you work for gets audited, does that mean that you'll get audited?
No, it doesn't mean that. So a lot of times, maybe you're talking about if the agencies have an IRS review, because that happens. That's common. I mean, the IRS is looking at bigger companies, so they're going to go, and to be audited doesn't mean anybody did anything wrong either. It's just the IRS pulls out, a few random percentage points every year and reviews the returns. So if they review a return, you know, if they audit an agency, it's not necessarily meaning the employees or the nurses will be audited. It doesn't mean that at all.
Okay, awesome. That's good to know. So I think we covered most of the questions. There's one little bit that I want to ask. I was just going to look at the questions people submitted. I think we actually answered most of these. So, but I know actually one of the questions is what we're going to talk about next. So let's get to it. Who should file my taxes, or who should file a travel nurse's taxes?
It's an easy one. No, so all right, so we can certainly help with that. That's a layup of a question. Thank you for that one. But
I know.
in general, if you have a tax preparer or someone that you're comfortable with, what I would say is important for a traveler is to make sure that tax preparer is familiar with and understands the nuances of how to maintain a tax home and make sure that that's being handled properly. That's number one. And number two would be to make sure that your state returns are prepared properly, that your CPA or tax preparer has experience preparing multiple state tax returns. So those are kind of the big ones to keep an eye on. So yeah, a lot of tax preparers, you know, may not have that experience, but there are some out there that do. And then, you know, if so, that's something to look for, those two things.
Okay. Yeah, just to kind of give like my personal experience with it, when I went to go file my taxes after my first year of travel nursing, I went to a very well-known tax preparation chain, and the guy looked at me like I had 5 heads when I told him, I was like, I'm a travel nurse, I need to know how to file this appropriately, and he didn't know anything about it. And so I just want to kind of reinforce that it's really helpful if you find someone that actually specializes in travel nurse taxes. It's kind of like my analogy is it's like asking, you know, a adult ICU nurse to go work in the pediatric ER with no training. Like if they don't know it, they're special. Like tax specialists are specialized, exactly. So, and I think it's important to kind of tell them a little bit about your practice. And someone just asked how much you charge a travel nurse tax, as well as what your thoughts are about TurboTax.
Sure. So the fee for a federal tax return is $225. We reduced it this year by 10%, and you know, just as kind of a way to kind of give back to all the nurses for the kind of impact the total cost you'll pay. There is a 25% coupon code that Trusted is going to offer everybody here. So anybody here who's listening or who sees this video can respond and send us a note on that, and we'll make sure we honor that. So TurboTax. TurboTax works if you have you know, it works well if you have the situation that, you know, it's sort of a more simple return. If you have a home state tax return to file, or maybe no state tax return if you're in Florida, you know, Texas, those states, and you have a W-2 without too many other things going on, it works. It's if you feel comfortable doing it. You know, I have people calling me sometimes trying TurboTax and it's maybe not working out, so they come back to us, or if they have multi-states, they usually have a hard time with TurboTax because it's not really designed to do a multi-state tax return. I think it is possible, but it's a little bit tricky to do that. So, yeah, so that's sort of the answer there.
Yeah. I think that if you feel really like you do your research, this is my personal opinion and I'm not a tax specialist, but I try to use TurboTax 1 year, and I think it's just something once you get in there and you don't feel comfortable, I would just really recommend going to find someone that really knows what they're doing. But like you said, you can do it, but you just need to make sure that you understand how to file everything correctly to make sure you're not only not paying too much, but that you're doing it the right way. Well, I think that's pretty much all the questions. Does anyone have any?
I do have one little anecdote to drop in here. So my wife is a nurse and she was a former traveler, right? So that's sort of how we got into this business too, many years back when she started as a travel nurse. And we sort of stick to, in the household, she takes care of the nursing related responsibilities. If one of the kids gets hurt or something's going on, and if I try to interject there, she sort of laughs at me. You know, it's not really your area of expertise, and I take care of the tax side, and so that's sort of how we split things up. So
that's awesome. Yeah, I forgot to mention that your wife is a travel nurse, and that's why he, you know, does this to help other travel nurses. And, you know, we've really enjoyed working with you, Joe, and you've been so patient and understanding with all of us and the nurses that you sent your way. So I really do want to recommend Joe if you all have any questions or are looking for someone to file your taxes. And just as a reminder, I dropped in the chat a few minutes ago. You can just mention Trusted Health, or you can share a code Trusted25 and they'll know when you submit your taxes to get that 25% discount with Joseph Conte. So I think that's pretty much it.
Sorry, Casey, one other comment. If you happen to be on this stream or see this video and you don't work for Trusted, you can still send us that code and we'll make a note of that.
Perfect. Yes, that's very important to note. So I am going to, I guess, what's the best way for them to reach you? I guess your website, right?
Yeah, the website is travelnursetax.com. You can send us an email or a chat from there, and we'll get that and respond as quickly as we can. Or there's a phone number there as well. You can call us, and we can connect that way.
All right, perfect. All right, I'm trying to make sure that I get this in the chat really quick, just for people to see that are with us. Here we go. It's a lot harder to type on your phone instead of phone stand, I'm realizing. All right, well, I guess that's it. Thank you all for joining us, you know, and Joe, thank you so much. That was really, really helpful. I kind of thought I knew a lot already from being a travel nurse for 3 years, but you really helped clarify things and break things down in a way that it was easy to understand. So I appreciate that. Everyone who joined us, we will be saving this to our Instagram TV channel. Go to Joe if you have questions about your taxes. And hopefully we'll see you at our next Instagram Live. Happy tax season.
Thank you, Casey. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye. Bye-bye.